Welcome everyone to the Ontology Summit 2026. Today is the 13th of May 2026, and we are continuing the interoperability track with Jim Wilson, and Todd Schneider will be chairing this session. So I'll hand it over to Todd.
Thank you, Will. I'm sorry. Thank you, Kenneth. So Jim Wilson is going to give our presentation today, and you can see his title right now, The Interoperability Fundamentals in the Age of AI. Jim is the president and CEO of OAGI. And be careful, their URL is oagi.org. They're a US-based nonprofit standards organization that was established in 1995, and their goal is to address interoperability challenges among ERP systems through standards development. So their mission in general is to continuously improve interoperability through business process models, data standards, ontologies, documentations, tools, best practices, and training. And I should also point out that OAGI is the parent organization of the Industrial Ontologies Foundries, IOF. And Jim just got back from the Caribbean, so he should be in a chipper mood for us. Take it away, Jim.
Uh, yeah, thank you, Todd. Indeed, I am. Yeah, I was in the lovely country of Anguilla, and maybe a fun fact at the beginning here. So, Anguilla is a tiny little island in the Caribbean. You can drive from one end to the other in about half an hour, and they have just totally revamped their airport. They're improving their roads. They're lowering taxes, all because of an influx of revenue because AI is the domain name, which I guess in their view stands for Anguilla Islands. So you got this tiny little Caribbean country, and they are selling so many domain names that they're just lowering taxes. And I saw it firsthand. I listened to the radio, a local news station, and they were talking about they just passed the 1 million mark. And these days, I don't know if anybody's purchased an AI domain lately, but they're selling them for, I think it's about $127, and you have to pay for register for a minimum of 2 years. So we're talking 250 plus US dollars to get a domain name, and all that money just goes to this tiny little Caribbean country. It's kind of funny. But anyway, thank you, Todd, for welcoming me. Just a few notes about myself. So, as Todd pointed out, I'm OAGI president and CEO, and I have two roles. I also have a role in a sister organization, a member of OAGI called Ag Gateway. It deals with agriculture industry standards, and there I'm the chief technology officer. I also serve as the IOF governance board chair. Todd is on the governance board as well. Also, I serve a couple roles in ISO TC 154, which is processes, data elements, and documents in commerce, industry, and administration. Notably, I'm the Working Group 7 Digital Business convener and co-convener for a joint working group with UNECE. And then finally, I also am the convener of the ISO Smart Farming Coordinating Committee, which is a committee that reports to the ISO board that coordinates smart farming standards or just data related standards in agriculture across all ISO committees. Now, I will say that in prep for this presentation, I told Todd, hey, yeah, I have a presentation all set. Won't be a problem for me to be ready. But last time I delivered it, it had more of an ag flavor. And so I just needed to kind of dial that back and have more of an industrial flavor. And Todd's like, no, just keep it ag. Let's have a kind of a different perspective on it. So this has an ag flavor to it, and that is intentional. Anyway, sometimes the ag people get tired of hearing me talk about aerospace and defense, and sometimes the A&D people get tired of hearing about agriculture. But I don't know where you lie, but we're going to have some ag discussion here. Okay, so interoperability. Again, how does AI impact interoperability fundamentals? Over my career, it is astonishing to me how poorly many people understand interoperability fundamentals. And a consequence of that is this constant pursuit of silver bullets over time. So let's just start here with, oh, I'm missing an in here. I just updated this slide. Data-driven agri-food systems. So digital agriculture is the agricultural production of food, fiber, and fuel through processes that are increasingly autonomous and driven by increasingly effective models with data input that is increasingly timely, relevant, accurate, complete, and trustworthy. The models are designed to maximize profitability and sustainability in optimal balance. All right. So again, with an agriculture theme, in agricultural production is increasingly, in my view, looking like any other manufacturing process. It's just messier, dirtier. The variables more difficult to measure and communicate and things like that. A couple of definitions. I know this is cliche for many presentations, but let's just get three of them out of the way. Interoperability, the ability of computer systems or software to exchange and make use of information. Value, the material or monetary worth of something, also the worth of something compared to the price paid or asked for it. And then finally, standard, something used as a measure, norm, or model in comparative evaluations, a form of language that is widely accepted as the usual form. And all these are from the Oxford Dictionary of English. All right, so let's talk about interoperability's centrality. Okay, centrality to what? Well, centrality to value creation. So we have interoperability, we have data-driven agri-food systems. Interoperability is required for data-driven agri-food systems, and the two of them together enables value creation. And then we have standards, additionally guidelines, best practices, tools, other resources, and those collectively enable interoperability. So again, the argument is you want to create value, and how do you do that? Or in a digital context, well, you need to improve interoperability. Okay, so let's talk about value. So what is it and who decides? Well, so what is value? Who decides? And the answer to that question is quite simply owners decide. All right. Now, there are lots of people who would argue and say, well, there's many more stakeholders regarding value. So it's not just owners. Well, try to tell the owners that. Okay. Now, you can make all sorts of moral arguments about what owners should value and what they should do with their money, what boards of directors should do. But ultimately, as it works in capitalistic economies, owners have money, they invest their money, and they expect certain things. So what do they expect? Do they expect, friendship, everybody around a fire, lighting sparklers, or what? Well, it turns out owners value cash flow. All right. And there's a quite simple formula for that. You have cash now and you have cash later. And then the cash later, to determine its present value, you have to apply a discount rate to it. Okay, and that's today's value, present value of a future cash flow. And then you take that collection of estimated future cash flows, add it to the cash flow now, and you end up with what's called NPV, net present value. Okay. Now, my argument here is this is what owners value. So an owner comes into a company and they say, I'm going to invest in your company and I expect more money later than what I put in today. All right. So how does this work? What does this formula look like in action? Okay. So you have a set of cash flows. All right. You have some expenses, you have some revenue over time, and you want to improve the NPV. Well, one is obviously to increase cash receipt. So you have a cash receipt and you add a couple to the third green one over there. That's an increase. Your NPV goes up. Owners like that. Okay. Add add a new cash receipt. All right. So you got a whole new one dropping in. All right. NPV goes up. Reduce a cash payment. So cash going out, you eliminate or reduce a cash payment. That increases NPV. Here we have eliminating a cash payment. So we're just getting rid of an entire cash out. Net present value goes up. NPV is higher. Also receive cash sooner. So we have cash that's coming in at time, 7 or whatever that is, and it drops back to time 4. NPV goes up, and pay cash later, the NPV goes up. And then finally, and this is one a lot of people miss, is making cash receipts less risky, and frankly, cash expenditures less risky. So let's say we have some risky cash flows, and to the extent we can make them less risky, we increase NPV. Okay, so here's the question. And this is going to be a common pattern across all of these categories that I'm going to walk through. So does value still matter? If it does it matter more or less? And what changes? So yes, value matters. Owners still care about money. It doesn't matter, in my view, in the age of AI, it doesn't matter more or less. It matters just the same. But what does change? I think that AI can help people, at least generative AI can help people explore what those value drivers are. I haven't tested this myself. I don't know if people are using it that way. But in my experience, AI is pretty useful in kind of elucidating thoughts about a matter, exploring a topic. So to the extent that you provide a high quality prompt to an AI system and say, hey, hey AI, Claude Code, whatever, help me think through what sort of cash receipts I might have in this kind of project. What might be some hidden expenses? What things might be risky? What can I do to mitigate those risks? So it could be that AI can help in those cases. Again, I haven't tested that, but in sort of parallel sorts of efforts with AI, that has been my experience so far. Okay, so decision making. This is key, just the fundamental aspect of choosing among alternative projects. Now, at this point in the presentation, you might be thinking, wait, I thought we were talking about interoperability. You're talking about value. You're talking about decision making. Well, let me just tell you that these two keys, value and decision making, get you to projects that enable interoperability. If interoperability is valuable, and I made the case for that at the beginning around data-driven agri-food systems as an example, you have to persuade people. People with budget authority need to make the decision, yes, I'm going to, instead of investing in an SAP upgrade or investing and sponsoring this golf tournament, we're going to take those funds and we're going to invest in an interoperability project. All right. If they're going to do that, they have to have some estimate of the value to the extent they take such decision making seriously. So again, decision making is about choosing among multiple projects. So we identify potentially valuable projects, then we compute the NPV for each and choose the one or maybe a set with the highest NPV. But here's the thing. The reality is it's not quite that simple. I mean, you do have MBA programs that go through all this stuff. And often the MBA programs sort of have use cases that are maybe not reflective of the real world. They're kind of like, the happy path for doing value analysis. But if you at least have in mind this process of have the mindset that any decision may come at any choice among a set of options often comes at the expense of other options. So in many cases, if you have 5 possibilities and all 5 are viewed as valuable projects, but you can only do 3, well, what that means is you can't do 2. And people need to make sure they have that mindset. Also, they need to understand that cash flows matter. And the idea that, oh, we're just going to, employees are going to be happier. While that's a great goal, you should probably, try to estimate the value to the company. And some companies do that. And so they can make cases for investing in certain aspects of projects. So, for example, in interoperability, if you think that in the case of AI, if you think that maybe having a budget uh, for AI tokens for, let's say, Claude Code will make your developers happier. Well, provided that they are at least a little more productive, it could be that it's justifiable in that case. So again, does decision making still matter? Well, of course it does. Of course it does. Does it matter more or less? It matters the same. AI doesn't change that. You still have to make decisions. What changes? Again, the same thing with value is if you can prompt AI with a set of alternatives and say, you can prompt it with something like, give me pros and cons for each of these alternatives. Similar to value, you can say, what are some maybe hidden risks for each of these alternatives that might make another one better? In other words, using AI to give you prompts to think through your various options in your decision making to finally choose the best one. Okay, so let's look at competitive advantage. So Harvard's Michael Porter wrote the book on competitive advantage, in my opinion, and he claims that typically companies plan to achieve and sustain competitive advantage through one or both of the following approaches: operational effectiveness or strategic positioning. And Porter stresses that operational effectiveness is not a strategy. So, strategic positioning attempts to achieve sustainable competitive advantage by preserving what is distinctive about a company. It means performing different activities from rivals or performing similar activities in different ways. I can't stress this enough. Performing different activities from rivals or performing similar activities in different ways. So the question is, does competitive advantage still matter? Again, of course it does. And this is the same pattern repeats with the same 3 questions. And it turns out pretty much a lot of the same answers. Does it matter more or less? It matters the same. Okay, what changes? Well, let's hold that thought and keep going. We'll revisit this in the next one. Competition in standards. Is this nonsense or is it common sense? So, as we reviewed in the last section, with competitive advantage, you want to perform, attempt to address it by performing different activities from rivals or performing similar activities in different ways than rivals. Well, what does it mean to standardize stuff? Well, perform some of the same activities as rivals and perform similar activities in the same ways as rivals. Okay, so what are we doing here? How does it make sense for any company to pursue standardization if this is true? Don't we have conflicting objectives here? Isn't standardization the very act of giving up on sustainable competitive advantage? And I would say not so fast. So the key word is some. Perform some of the same activities, perform some similar activities. Okay, so now the question is which ones and why? Okay, you can imagine in a world where you have let's say within the United States we have different voltages for electricity. who's benefiting from different voltages for electricity? All right. Let's say also that you have rail tracks that are spaced apart differently depending on which part of the country. How does anyone benefit from having non-standard rail tracks? All right. So the point here is that yes, competitive advantage requires different activities or doing different things or doing the same things differently than your rivals. But there's some fundamental level of standardization that it can enable an entire industry. And that's what we seek to accomplish in the standards world, or at least the standards world I'm involved in. So, do competition and standards still matter? Yeah, they matter more than ever. Um, so I would say, yeah, actually, well, competition matters as much as it always has, and I would argue that standards matter more. Okay, so what changes? And I told you in the previous one um, on standards and competition. We'll dive down on it here. And my view with respect to what changes with AI regarding standards and competition and the balance of them is that there are many people out there that I've heard over the past couple of years, but more intensely in the past few months, claiming that with AI, we don't need standards anymore. And I would argue that no, standards can provide the guardrails for a let's say more trustworthy AI experience for companies. I haven't proven that out yet because AI seems to be quite adept at circumventing what you declare it needs to follow. But I think that there are techniques being explored, best practices being um, observed and documented about how to ensure or I guess maybe direct AI to provide or to stick to the guidelines that are put in place. And I think standards are a fantastic way to do that. Okay, so let's keep moving. We got a lot more stuff to get through here. So let's talk about standards influencers. Who's who and why you should care or not. So there's a lot of categories. Governments set laws. They fund research. There's also global de jure standards organizations like ISO, IEC, ITU, national standards orgs like ANSI, DIN, and so on. Multinational standards organizations like SIN in Europe, industry associations like OAGI and Ag Gateway, professional associations, all sorts of other associations. Companies, you can think of like Microsoft's ODBC back in the day, and also like Esri's shapefile. Various initiatives, projects, and programs. Informal groups. There's informal groups. IOF started as an informal group developing some standards. There's also an example in the agriculture industry around soil testing standards. And then people. There are a handful of people whose ideas are just so compelling, they end up just being viewed as a standard. And over time, they often become actual standards in the case of Tim Berners-Lee through the W3C and other organizations. So in agriculture, again, continuing with the ag theme, lots of universities have a great deal of influence, many in the United States. Wageningen University of Research in the Netherlands is quite prolific in influencing standards. Of course, we have ISO, and I've already mentioned at Gateway, a partner, a sister organization to OAGI. OAGI also, as Todd introduced. Also in the ag industry, we have the Agriculture Industry Electronics Foundation. They set standards for interoperability among agriculture equipment, so tractors to sprayers, tractors to seeders, combine harvesters to grain carts to trucks, and so on. And then, of course, there's research organizations There's Land Care Research in New Zealand, CSIRO in Australia, NIST in the US, Fraunhofer in Europe. So, do standards influencers still matter? Yes. If they do they matter more or less? I think they matter at least as much, if not more. And what changes? Here's what changes with all these standards influencers. They need a sharper, clearer message. Why? Because as I mentioned a few minutes ago, there are lots of people who are making the claim that, oh, standards don't matter, just have AI do it. AI can just figure it all out. You don't need standards. So let's move on to standardization dynamics. The things that influence standards: money, control, actually career and lifestyle play a role. There are many sort of career and lifestyle standards people who are just willing to do a lot of work for a little money, but have their travel comped. Um, Also, a thing that this is a big one is participation levels. And in my experience, there are those who participate in standardization with the idea to lead to succeed. I would say Todd is in that category. Todd leads various activities within the IOF, including chairing the technical oversight board. That's a lead to succeed effort on his part. Then there are those who contribute. They're not leading, but they're contributing to the success. There are some who just observe. They're there to do reconnaissance. Their competitors are there, and so they're in the room to see what's going on. There are some who literally show up to obstruct. Like, we have a competitive advantage in this area. We talked about that earlier. My company does it better than others. I don't want to standardize that because it either raises others up to our level or makes us have to comply with something where we already have an advantage and we would lose it. And then, believe it or not, there are some who seek leadership positions for the intention to drive it into the dirt. I've seen that happen a few times. Also, the power of stories and putting them into writing. That is so key. There are many cases where people take great pride in their level of abstract conversation, and abstractions are critical to developing good standards. But I'll tell you what's even more important in my view is getting good stories from domain experts in writing. And finally, the criticality of completeness and the peril of shortcuts. You gotta do a good job. There every case where people have tried to do shortcuts with standards, and one I'm going to talk about here in a second is with relation to defining processes. It inevitably leads to standards that are convoluted or just not finished, and therefore aren't implemented or are really confusing to implement. And one quote I love from somebody I worked with at Cargill back in the day is, always choose clarity over cleverness. So maybe there's a very clever, elegant way to express some code, some part of a standard. Well, that cleverness may not fully be appreciated, first of all. And second of all, if people can't understand it, well, they can't appreciate how clever it is, but they certainly can't implement it. So always choose clarity, even if it's a little more verbose. And then finally, don't let perfect be the enemy of good enough. So, I talked about the criticality of completeness and the peril of shortcuts. You got to balance that with, at some point, you just got to go with good enough. And I appreciate through our ontology work that good enough, that the standard for good enough in the ontology world is much, much higher. So in the other standards that we create in OAGI, the enterprise canonical standards, we're very careful to emphasize these are not ontologies. Heck, they're not even enterprise data standards or enterprise models, I should say. These are standards for moving data around in the enterprise. Okay, so good enough there is actually, a fairly low bar. Are we being consistent? Are we are we defining these things with good, solid definitions? But I appreciate that with ontologies, that bar is way, way up there. Maybe it does have to be perfect. Here's just a quick thing. Remember, we're on the, kind of the pathways to standards here. Here's the path of one of Ag Gateway's irrigation standards as an example. So Ag Gateway, the industry organization, consulted the Australian research organization, CSIRO, regarding irrigation standards. The US submitted standardization, the standard for US national standardization for the American Society of Agricultural and Biological Engineers, which is an accredited as a U.S. national standards body. And then that was ASABE submitted the standard to ISO for international standardization. So that's kind of a path. So do standardization dynamics still matter? Yeah, of course they do. Do they matter more or less? They matter pretty much the same, and I'm not sure. I don't. No ideas come to mind presently about what changes there. Okay, let's talk about context. Inescapable and sometimes tragically ignored. So context is in terms of standards and standards development. It is the kind of the frame of mind that you bring to whatever it is you're standardizing. And it always matters. So if you are creating a bill of materials for an F-35 fighter jet aileron, that is different than a bill of materials for, let's say, some Land O'Lakes cheese. Now, it turns out that those are real world examples, and both Lockheed Martin and Land O'Lakes use OAGI's bill of materials standard for the production of ailerons and for the production of cheese. But what they need in that bill of materials is dictated by context. All right. So context always matters. It's often intuitive, obvious, and consequently not worth explicitly identifying, but when in doubt, call it out. And it almost always has a relationship to scope. So as many of you know, Todd is a big fan of natural language definitions for things. I am too. But in my view, context always goes hand in hand with defining things, because a world where definitions apply universally is just not a very interoperable world in my view. It's much more constructive to be clear about your context. I'm talking about harvesting corn in the United States. Okay, what does the data I collect through my agricultural equipment look like when I'm harvesting corn in the United States? So that's key. All right, so does context still matter? Well, yeah, yes, it does. Does it matter more or less? I think it matters the same, but I think people are appreciating that it matters more now. What changes? Well, I think that people, as they are getting experience using AI, they appreciate just how kind of context dumb AI is. Or maybe to put it differently, it's a little unfair to expect AI to read your mind about what context should bound its its processing that produces results. So I'm actually kind of encouraged that maybe AI helps people think in more context specific terms. All right, so let's talk about process. So with no process, you don't have business. You don't have process improvement. You don't have competitive advantage. You don't need data. You don't need customers. You don't need suppliers. You don't create value. All right. I know this is pretty dramatic here. Processes matter. That's what businesses do. That's how you make money. That's how you outcompete your competitors. That's why you need data flowing around. Again, that's how you create value. And in my view, there's kind of three high levels of processes. All right, there's products and services flow, there's money flow, and there's data flow. Words and pictures. Sometimes it's really important, sometimes critical to document your processes in words and pictures. Remember my earlier comment about taking shortcuts? And with words, you can have stories, you can have use cases, you can have agile style user stories. And back of the napkin is a good start. But I'm telling you, documenting your processes is so helpful. So now we have standard versus intuitive process modeling. I would argue that random shapes and colors are great for children's cereal, but not process diagrams. Raise your virtual hand if you've ever seen process diagrams where someone has, a blue star, a yellow heart, a dashed green line between the two. And to them, it's all intuitive. But to the rest of the group, you're like, I don't know what those colors mean or those shapes mean or how that documents a process. Well, intuitiveness is in the eye of the author often. I was in a meeting in Geneva with the chemical industry, and I was facilitating it around documenting various logistic processes. And somebody had created just such a diagram. I mean, they had squares in different colors, solid lines, dashed lines. And I just asked the question, okay, what does the dashed line mean versus a solid line? And turned out no answer, just felt like making it dashed. Okay, that's pretty rough. We need intuitive diagrams are not so intuitive when it comes to process diagrams. In other words, it's not so common sense. Using color is fine as long as you say what the colors are. Always provide a legend. Be mindful of color blindness. We do have standards for process models. UML and BPMN are kind of leaders in that area, notably UML sequence diagrams, fantastic for quick and dirty diagrams. State model diagrams and activity model diagrams are kind of complementary diagrams. BPMN has I think, finally settled the process modeling wars. Format wars. It's very well accepted for more sophisticated process modeling. Love using BPMN. And it's pretty simple. Get somebody that knows what they're talking about, ask them questions, write down what they say, estimate the value of composing formal written use cases, create a diagram, maybe start with the sequence diagram. At some point, determine if you'll address as is and to be or both. So do you want to document how the process works today, how the process works, you want the process to work in the future? I mean, you're doing an interoperability project, so you probably have a future state that you're trying to get to, or do you want to do both? And then estimate the value of doing a BPMN model or diagram. Just because you can do certain things, that doesn't mean you have to do them. Just do the work to the level of sophistication for the problem at hand. Here's a real world example. This is the interoperability in nutrient management or the nutrient loop, or you can think of fertilizer. And I'm not even going to explain this, but in about 15 minutes, I went through and created this plant UML script from which I could create the UML sequence diagram. And I think you would agree that going from this to this is an improvement and more clear, despite the one on the right not even having color in it other than black and white. So how can AI help? Or does process still matter? Well, yeah, it matters. It matters just the same as it always has. What changes? Well, here's what changes. Uh, this stuff here, you can actually ask AI to help you create this kind of stuff. All right. This is Plant UML. Mermaid is a good alternative to this. Works really well. We don't have time to go into these to the details. I have a whole nother presentation online about how to create these things. You can ask AI to help you create these things, and it's fantastic. And there's no cost to it. Okay. We're getting near the end here. All right. So data. Um, Yeah, we can actually just skip this because you all are no doubt familiar with the process of data moving around. Um, and maybe just a quick note. I mean, this is the typical process. You have the sender and the receiver, and you're determining required info, gathering it, expressing it in some form, transforming it in agreed upon format, validating, maybe digitally signing it, sending it. It goes through to an API, and you kind of unwind it all. In the mix is authentication and authorization. You're also checking for well-formedness and initial validation. So moving on here with the anatomy of a standard. You often have names, versions, structures, types, which include strings, numbers, dates, booleans, code lists, identifier schemes, and semantics. Also, we have syntax with JSON, XML, EDI, Apache Avro, message pack. The syntax goes on and on for syntaxes. Uh, Here's some examples of from New Zealand. Again, this is an ag theme. We have OAGI's Connect Spec. OAGI created this standard based on ISO, or it complies with ISO 15000 Part 5. We have over 75 documented processes and over 1,000 defined messages to support those processes. And we have an excellent tool we have co-developed with NIST to manage that standard. And it supports many syntax expressions. We also have AGI standards and Ag XML for industrial chemical, for AGI standards, also known as CHEMI standards, and Ag XML, which is for grain industry messages. The grain industry supports contract settlements, shipments, weights, grades, etc. Then Adapt, which is an open source project and toolkit. So there's C# code out there for promoting interoperability among various field operations data formats. So John Deere may produce data in a certain format on its tractors, and then a farmer needs to load it into their farm management information systems, and they can use Gateway's toolkits, and they use OAGI's tooling for that. And of course, there's ISO XML, which is its formal name is ISO 11783 Part 10, and that's for field operations data format at more of a device level. So AI, does data still matter? Well, yes, of course, it matters just as much. What changes? Well, you can actually use AI to assist with mapping in some cases, and your mileage may vary. I think there's a lot of people doing a lot of work in this area. It does seem to be getting better, and I suspect that trend will continue. One thing well, no, I'm going to hold this thought because I've got semantics here in a second. Then finally, there's moving data around, message transport and routing with both A to A, application to application, and B to B, business to business. There's some shared requirements between those two. There's some that are distinct. Your messaging options there are band-based EDI, RNIF, also Rosetta Net Implementation Framework, which is kind of both of these are pretty old. I'm not hearing people implementing new instance of those. There's EBMS, which has evolved, CAS4 for that. There's also AS1, 2, 3, and 4. WSDL SOAP-based web services, these are kind of passe. There's still some out there, not a lot of people using them. RESTful web services, they've been the rage for quite some time and still kind of are. And there's many, many others. Again, RESTful web services are where it's at. One thing I'll point out is just beware of this logic. Why all the complicated machinery? Just use diesel. So the analogy there is, or comparison is, I often hear people say, "Why don't you just do this?" And it's sort of like, yeah, but what you're the problem to be solved is complicated, and you're just taking a piece of it. You're saying, why don't you just do this simple thing? Well, often doing the simple thing in one area just causes more complication in other areas. And over the years doing integration efforts, there are good and there are bad vendor solutions. So let's say you've got this big green chunk of functionality in your enterprise full of non-trivial requirements. Okay, this is a set of requirements with a certain amount of complication that just cannot be simplified. A good vendor solution is one where the vendor comes along and they create value by reducing costs and or delivering better outcomes. They admit that there's no silver bullet, but our experienced team can help. And in terms of Ag Gateway members, again, in the agriculture context, Ag Gateway members value vendors. They call them allied providers, solution providers allied to the ag industry. Now let's talk about the bad vendor solution. The bad vendor solutions tend to move complexity around without creating value. So they basically say, let's just keep things simple. Why overcomplicate things? Just use our solution. And so they jam their solution in, get paid a lot of money, but really what they've done is they maybe have simplified where their solution goes, but at the expense of complicating all sorts of other stuff. So ultimately you have the same complexity, the same requirements. You've just paid a bunch of money to move the complexity around. And they say, see there, things are so much simpler where our solution is used. It really brings attention to how overcomplicated the other parts of your system are. We can help. And then, and then they offer solutions in other areas and start moving complexity around again. So beware of that. We're getting close to out of time. Let's move on. Needless to say, blockchain, cool technology, promising. I think it has a future, but not in the ways it was promoted over the years. And that was often by doing what I referred to earlier as making shortcuts. All right. Blockchain should have been about improving processes, but it was sold as a bolt-on solution to any existing process to make it better without even understanding the process, much less deciding how you're going to make it better with blockchain. Okay. And let's move on from API. Again, we are getting very short on time. And yeah, the last one I want to address is reference data and semantics, and then we're done. May have time for a couple questions. So reference data and semantics, making sense of what you have. So some of you may have seen this diagram or this sort of depiction of data and semantics. So you've got your iceberg in the ocean, and you've got the part of the iceberg above sea level and the part of the iceberg below the sea level. The part below the sea level is semantics, and above sea level is everything else. Developers will love to talk with you all day about the merits of JSON over XML, or this tech stack over that tech stack. But the real value in business is making sense of stuff. And in my view, there's kind of a continuum of the kinds of data and its meaning. There's Boolean, the true false, computation related numbers and date and time. Then there's fixed code lists, for example, days of the week. There's infrequently changing code lists, for example, currency codes. There's frequently changing code lists, maybe something like commodity codes in agriculture. Then there's identifier schemes, something like GS1's global location number. And then finally, there's freeform text. And you need to make sense of all these. You need to understand how data is tagged. If you have name value pairs or maybe a XML element or attribute or a JSON property, what is its name? How is it defined? And then the value itself you have to make sense of. So if the quantity is 12, Well, that 12 needs to be paired with a unit of measure. Pretty common sense. Also, there's a binary format. So just a quick note about Ag Gateway. They have a system called the Agriculture Industry Identification System with databases and services. They have assigned over 5 million GLNs to farmers, businesses, and their locations. 200,000 GTINs, global trade item numbers, are registered in this database, and over 665,000 seed licenses. And this is just Ag Gateway as an industry association that is managing these things to help improve semantic interoperability in the industry. And they make that available versus RESTful web services. So do reference data and semantics still matter? Oh, yeah. Yeah, it matters. They matter just as much as always. But what changes? Well, here's the thing. Along with AI, there seems to be an increase in interest with ontologies, and so I think if you can, we're testing some of these things and beginning to write a paper, launching a working group, or have launched a working group in OAGI to say, okay, how do canonical standards, AI, and ontologies kind of relate to one another? How can ontologies use to help provide those guardrails for AI? Or I'm sorry, yeah, to make guardrails for AI. Um, to what extent can ontologies tag just standard data that makes no claim to any sort of ontological completeness? How can ontologies be used to tag that data to help AI maybe in mapping processes? So I think there's going to be a lot of progress around improving semantics. One point of concern I have is that there are a lot of cases where people the most troubling place is people within a company, they don't understand their own data. They've got some data format and it has field names, and people don't know, like the domain expert retired 5 years ago, and they don't know what it means, and they just think AI is going to tell them the answer. Okay. It could be, I don't know, maybe AI can kind of, identify some patterns that sort of reveal what something means. I suppose that's possible. I haven't seen it yet or very often. Um, but but yeah, the world really needs to capture the expertise of these domain experts, because I see AI replacing people at companies, and these people kind of take an early retirement. They're taking early retirement and all that tribal knowledge with them. And I'm really concerned that AI is not going to be able to fill that gap. So anyway, that's it. I hope that was quite a flyby here, but I guess back to you, Todd and Ken.
Okay. Well, Jim, that was great. Um,
Oh, thank you.
I am myself not familiar with all that goes on in agriculture, but I do like to eat. I'm sort of addicted to it. So as
Hmm.
convener, I get to ask the first couple of questions. One
Hmm.
thing that I didn't hear you bring into play is the quantity or the amount of data. In the past, when people were writing reports or writing down their measurements, they would do it on paper. But now, as you pointed out, agriculture has so many electronic systems to collect data and make use of that. So, in terms of interoperability, wouldn't you agree that because there's such a huge influx and increasing amount of data that the issues of interoperability become more important if you want to create value from it?
Oh yeah, absolutely. One story I tell when I have hours to present instead of about one, is that the Ohio State University, Dr. John Fulton there led a team of researchers there, and just for one growing season on a medium-sized farm in the Midwest, they collected all the data for that one season. And yeah, my question is kind of hypothetical. How much data do you think was collected? And people have all sorts of guesses, and most are not even close. They collected 65 petabytes of data for one medium-sized farm for one season. And that's mind-blowing. And think
Wow.
about, you talk about rural connectivity being a challenge, broadband, rural broadband in America. So yeah, so not only interoperability, semantics, those things matter, but frankly, just moving that much data around can be a challenge too. But yeah, absolutely, it matters so much with so much data available.
Yes. I'm very familiar with the lack of any bandwidth in rural areas. I'm connecting via satellite because of that lack.
Right.
So, one last question. I'll let other people ask. I'm sure they have, I know they
Hmm.
have questions. Um, you did a lot, or OAGI does a lot with standards, and
Hmm.
you express the value of having them and using them properly. So my question, since the talk was included the notion of AI, how do you envision AI being used to create or revise standards in terms of in the context of any value such changes or creations may engender?
Yeah, fantastic question. I'm still, I haven't reached any conclusions, but AI seems to be useful in ways that most people would guess so far. So here's an example. USDA launched a project a few years ago to, standardize what's called acreage reporting in the US. They paid a vendor. The vendor created like a data format for it. And just in the past couple of weeks, USDA has said, "Oh, we kind of want to revise this stuff." You may have heard they granted Palantir a boatload of money to, help process acreage reporting data. And so in that gateway, they came to that gateway and said, "Okay, look, what do you guys have for standards, and how does it relate to this work we did a few years ago?" And so we used AI to say, here's our adapt standard, that standard for field data, field operations data, and then here's this thing this vendor did, or this contractor did, to say, okay, here's the data that's required to serve this purpose. Evaluate the gaps, the overlaps and gaps between these two. And AI did a pretty good job. I mean, I think AI presently serves as a way to get started in something. So many people, definitely me included, are better editors than we are creators. So I think in those kind of environments, if you know kind of the boundaries around what you want to accomplish, AI can be very, very useful for just getting started and doing some kind of busy work. Beyond that, there are no doubt many other ways AI can be useful, but I think we're just still exploring them right now.
Okay, thank you. Um,
Mhm.
anyone else have questions of Jim? I realize he covered a wide scope of material. The introduction of this notion of value in terms of interoperability, I thought was quite interesting. I myself will have to say that's one of those things that, yeah, of course it's going to create value, but I never bring it to the fore in such discussions. So thank you for raising that, Jim.
Mhm.
Janet has her hand up.
Anyone else?
Janet?
One, I would like to make a comment about standards, and one thing that is a very important standard is common logic, which is an ISO standard and which has a mapping to any and every notation available. Some notations are not precisely defined, but anything that is precisely defined can be translated to and from some version of common logic, which is a superset of all of the other notations that people have provided. And one advantage of that is that it gives you a way of relating everything. But most important, there are tools that can translate ordinary languages like English to and from common logic, so that what you can do is take any notation of any kind, map that to common logic, and then carry on a dialogue in English or French or Chinese with anybody and have that be translated to and from common logic in a precise form. And that way you can use AI tools They are very, very important for mapping languages. They can map the language of any kind of notation anybody has defined to and from common logic, and from to and from common logic to any ordinary natural language. That enables anybody with any level of understanding to carry on a dialogue. Now, what one person says originally is not necessarily going to be precise enough to go into the common logic, but the translation mechanisms can come back and say, map what they say to the internal form, and then map it back and say, into their own language and say, is this what you mean? And if they say no, then what you do is carry on a dialogue until the person and the computer agree on this official standard formula in common logic. That is a way of translating any kind of notation, diagrams of any kind to and from a common logic, and then from the common logic back and forth to any natural language, and carry on a dialogue so that as a result, at the end of the dialogue, the human and the machine have an exact formal representation of exactly what they mean.
Okay,
That's
thank you,
technology.
John. I'm
That
sure.
technology is
John.
available today.
John, I don't know if Jim is that familiar with common logic, but thank you for letting him know about that. Janet has a question or has her hand up. Janet, would
Yes.
you like to ask Jim
Yes.
some questions?
Thanks. I think this is wonderful. It's very refreshing because this gets us out of the usual framings that we sort of cycle between in thinking about IT ontologies, and which are sort of at the tip of the iceberg of what you're talking about, which is the whole world of standardization and why people do things that they do. You know, they invest money to produce value. They standardize when they get benefit out of it. They don't standardize when they get benefit out of that. And that is the broader grounding picture of ontologies. Ontologies are standards. It was the whole idea of an ontology is that it's a standardized world model, and semantic standards are standards, languages are standards, codes are standards. We get benefit from using the same codes. We get benefit from using secret codes. So the bigger picture of the issues that need to be addressed in ontology development and use, I think, is wonderfully grounded in more ways than one in your agriculture picture. I'm glad you kept the agriculture context because that's something I don't think about at all. So it was good to see the usual, more of the business perspective of the NPV and the Porter competitive advantage and the de jure and de facto standards and all of that in agriculture on the one end and IT ontologies on the other hand. John often uses a picture in his presentations, I think, about people, or I've seen it maybe on just the forum, but if someone says, we have too many standards here, we have to develop a new standard to integrate them. Well, now we just have one more standard than we had before. So we haven't really gotten to the interoperability. Anyway, so that's right. Just really happy that you brought all this into the discussion, and I hope other people can see how that all relates to the narrower issues that we're usually concerned with.
Yeah, thanks, Jen. That does bring to mind for me, similar to that, just one more standard, is what I've observed both in the United States and the European Union regarding funded projects is so many times, and I see this especially in agriculture projects, but also in other domains as well, is when an organization is awarded some funding, they see it as license to send the intern out to the office supply store and buy new whiteboard markers, dry erase markers, and they're going to do it right because doggone it, they're smarter than everyone else because they got the award. This is a problem that needs to be solved. They can't be weighed down from, flawed thinking of the past. And so what they do is just reinvent a bunch of stuff instead of leveraging what's out there. And frankly, I've been, a part of that, not in the reckless manner I described, but there have been things that OAGI and at Gateway over the years have developed. It's like, oh crap, I didn't realize that thing existed. We could have leveraged that and saved ourselves some time. So yeah, being team players, being aware of what's out there, and just being willing to recognize the messy, messy world we live in. That maybe instead of saying we're going to make the one thing that solves all problems, maybe you make one thing that's so good that maybe more people use it and stop using 15 other things. But there's still 5 things out there. Like have an attitude of making things better instead of making the one thing perfect that you're going to later persuade everybody to adopt. It's hard.
Thanks. Hey, Terry, you have your hand up.
Yes,
Yeah,
Terry
thank you.
also has their hand up.
Terry.
Sorry. This is Terry.
Yeah, there you are. Okay, go ahead.
Did you ask me? Okay. Jim, this has been very fascinating to me. I'm in my middle 80s right now, and I've been programming since the 60s. Um, the whole idea of having a standard to me is that the more you have, the less you know. So somehow we have to figure out a way to integrate all of those, and I've always thought that was what ontologies were for. Um, well, I'm sorry, that's just kind of the starting point. I don't want to take too much time, but as I say, I'm in my 80s, and 2 years ago I became a farmer. Uh,
Okay.
I bought an 80-acre field from a from a relative's larger farm, and it turns out that that's being uh, harvested for hay every year. So I'm getting like $200 a year, and I'm worried that what you're talking about, this bar the field operations data collection.
Hmm.
I'm worried that I haven't been told how to reply to that. Because, all I see is they send me a check every year for the hay they've gathered, and it's not much.
Hmm.
Anyway,
Yeah.
that the point I guess I'm getting at is that this is a new standard that I never knew about before.
Hmm.
And I've been working on standards development since well, forever. Anyway, thank you.
Yeah. I'd be happy to share more offline. Yeah, it does seem. I mean, your comment about standards existing to well, I forgot how you put it. Like standards exist to help promote interoperability across disparate systems. I would agree with that. I think that one of the or I'm sorry, you said ontologies were helping to
Yeah, I
bridge
hope.
divides among standards. Yes, and that's my sense as well. What I've observed is that I mean, I think it was John talking about common logic, which yes, I have heard of. I'm not an expert. Heck, I'm not even an expert in BFO, and OAGI uses that. But what I've observed is that along with ontologies, certainly along with standards, comes a required mindset for it to be useful. For this thing to be useful, use the thing, and to use the thing effectively, think this way. And I think that's kind of in line to some extent with my earlier comments about context. And so, there's a lot of people there's in the standards world generally for data standards. Yeah, there's kind of some trash talking here and there about various standards. But I'll tell you, you guys in the ontology world, oh, common logic is flawed in 18 different ways. Well, BFO is horrible. You'd never use it for this or that. And just like all sorts of claims. And the problem is for most practitioners, or I shouldn't say practitioners, for managers who are funding or not funding, back to my points about where's value created, if their view is there's a bunch of nerds that are just arguing about what's the greatest thing ever, where all the other things are horrible, and there's just no consensus, they're just like, well, in terms of the value, they're looking at that and they're like, well, all that sounds super, super risky. Yeah, we're not doing that. I have a friend that works at Syngenta, which is one of the world's largest seed and crop protection companies, and he has a joke or there's a joke going around among his colleagues that ontologies are, if you want to end your career, propose an ontology project in your company. Now, to be fair, he said that's changing, and it's changing quickly. Like people are starting to see some benefit, but for a long time that was like a real risk that somebody would make all sorts of promises, and they'd make all sorts of investment, those red down arrows, and none of the green, up blocks would occur in the diagram, and they'd actually literally get fired. Again, I want to stress that is changing, even within his company, as much as he still jokes about it.
Oh, Jim, I have a more technical question. This is Gary Bergcross. You might have seen some of my comments in the chat. So we deal in this ontology summit with a range of semantic resources, not only ontologies, but knowledge graphs and controlled vocabularies. And I was wondering about the mix of things in those categories for interoperability. Now, to ensure interoperability, for example, you might build a knowledge graph for ag, but you would leverage things like a crop ontology, ENVO, plant ontologies, the agrovoc vocabulary, many other things, some of which I've listed in there, some for ag processes as opposed to the agriculture entities themselves. And I'm just wondering whether OAGI has looked at some of that, supports any of that, because that would be some of the interoperability work that we'd be interested in knowing about.
Yeah, that's a good question. And by the way, so for those of you posting to the chat window, I mean, I'm actually in presentation mode, so I haven't been following chat at all. So please don't be offended if since I've missed stuff. But I will say that OAGI has developed ontologies. Ag Gateway, my other hat, and the ag focused group has not engaged in any ontology development yet. However, Gateway is aware of Agrovoc. It's aware of other things in ISO, in particular ISO TC 347, a fairly new one, chaired by this friend of mine I was talking about from Syngenta. That group has an ontology, I think, ad hoc group presently to begin exploring that stuff. So in a gateway in agriculture circles, neither OAGI nor Ag Gateway have developed any ontologies specifically for agriculture. Not that some of OAGI's industrial ontology foundation work some of that might apply, but it wasn't we don't have any use cases for agriculture. And I am intent to the extent I have influence, and I do, over agriculture standards development. Yeah, there's stuff out there that we need to fully appreciate before taking any steps to develop an ontology.
Yeah, it
or
would seem
set of
important
ontologies.
because for data interoperability, you need essentially standardizing on metadata, which ontologies help you with.
Yes.
And so that seems like an obvious step to try to take.
Right. Yeah, and thank you for mentioning metadata. I didn't have this in my presentation, but I mean, metadata is huge. It's a huge topic in agriculture. So, FAIR, that set of principles, that's all over agriculture. And so metadata seems to be a thing that, I mean, it has always mattered, but it seems to matter to people more and more. They're paying closer attention to metadata. Um, and of course, we didn't even talk about data security, data privacy. I mean, there's so many areas we didn't touch, but heck, I do this kind of training over over 6 3-hour courses rather than one hour meeting. So I see John has his hand up.
John,
Yes, one of the points that I keep making, I'm not recommending that anybody learn common logic. What I am saying is that there are methods for translating natural languages, like English, for example, to and from common logic by means of a dialogue. As a result of that dialogue, you get a precise mapping in common logic internally, not visible by any human, but then that common logic can then be translated by precise methods to any or every formal notation of any kind. So the idea is you're not using common logic. You're not telling anybody that they have to learn common logic. All you're saying is that you can communicate with a computer with your own language. You can talk to English in it and carry on a dialogue in English. That dialogue then gets mapped into any or every internal notation that anyone has ever developed. That's what I'm saying.
thanks, John. Um, so we're running a bit over. Unless there are any other urgent questions. Yeah, it's unfortunate that we don't have time to go through all of the chat comments, but um, I want to thank Jim for a very enlightening talk.